The crash of on Miles had always trusted his instincts in the cockpit. He'd flown through asteroid belts, outrun pirate ships, and completed missions deep in enemy territory, but nothing in his training had prepared him for this. The sky above him was a blaze of fire and broken metal as his starfighter spiraled down toward the surface of an unknown planet. Warning lights screamed from the control panel. Systems offline, shields down, engines crippled. He gritted his teeth and pulled hard on the manual yoke, trying to slow the descent. Below, a dense alien forest rushed up to meet him. With a deafening crash, the ship tore through the trees. Branches smashed against the cockpit glass. The force slammed Evan forward as the ship skidded through thick underbrush, sparks flying, then the engine sputtered out, and everything went dark. Evan gasped, coughing in the smoke. He reached up, pulling off his cracked helmet. Blood trickled down his temple, but he was alive. He unbuckled himself and kicked open the emergency hatch. The humid air hit him immediately, thick with the scent of moss, earth, and something floral he couldn't identify. The forest was vast and strange. Towering purple-leafed trees reached hundreds of feet into the sky. Their branches twisted unnaturally, casting long shadows even under the planet's two suns. The ground pulsed with strange glowing fungi, and the air buzzed with distant animal calls, none of them friendly. Evan limped out of the wreckage, grabbing a small survival pack and a sidearm. His comms were dead. No signal, no GPS, no emergency beacon working. He was stranded, still bleeding and dazed. He moved cautiously into the forest, scanning for shelter. As he pushed past a curtain of glowing vines, he stumbled into a froze. There was something massive moving in the distance. He ducked behind a tree, holding his breath. Through the leaves, he saw it. A giant, easily 30 feet tall, humanoid, but not human. The being had smooth, pale blue skin that shimmered slightly in the light. Long, flowing white hair draped across her back, tangled with leaves and flowers. Her eyes were large and glowing with a soft, violet hue. She was barefoot, and each step she took made the ground tremble. Evan's heart pounded. This couldn't be real. He'd heard story-style tales from explorers about giant beings on fringe worlds, but no one ever had proof, until now. The giantess bent down near a pond, sipping water with cupped hands. That's when she turned and looked straight at him. He panicked and tried to back away, but his injured leg gave out. He crashed to the ground with a sharp cry. She stood to full height and began walking toward him. Evan scrambled back, raising his weapon. "Stay back. I'm armed." She didn't understand the words, but she stopped a few feet away. Her expression wasn't angry or hungry, it was curious. Evan's mind raced. She must be some kind of predator. A carnivore, maybe. She hunted smaller beings like him. That's what all the stories said, giant aliens that ate humans whole. She knelt beside him. Her fingers were massive, yet she moved delicately, like she didn't want to frighten him. "Don't touch me," he muttered, but his voice shook. The giantess tilted her head. Her eyes sparkled as she studied him. Then she reached down, not to grab him, but to gently brush a leaf off his shoulder. Evan flinched. She could crush him without effort. But instead, she looked concerned. Her gaze shifted to the blood on his head. She made a soft humming sound, something between a whisper and a song. Then she reached out again, this time picking him up carefully, in both hands like someone might cradle a bird. Evan shouted, kicking, "Put me down," but she didn't hurt him. She began walking with large, slow steps, carrying him through the forest. Her body heat radiated around him, warm and steady. He kept expecting sharp teeth or claws, but none came. They moved for what felt like hours, deeper into the forest. Eventually, she stepped into a giant cavern, hidden behind a waterfall. The inside was lit by glowing crystals, and filled with oversized furniture made from carved stone and wood. This was her home. She set him down gently on a cushion made from moss and plant fibers. Then she walked away to a large shelf, and returned with a bowl full of glowing blue liquid. Evan was too stunned to resist. She dipped a finger into the bowl, and lightly dabbed it on his wounded head. A tingling warmth spread across his skin. The bleeding stopped. He stared up at her, speechless. She wasn't eating him. She was helping him. She sat across from him, watching quietly as he caught his breath. The look in her eyes was calm, maybe even kind. Still, Evan didn't lower his guard. This planet, this situation, this creature, it was all too strange, too dangerous, but for now, he was alive. And the giantess hadn't eaten him yet, asked ChatGPT. Cage and the kindness Evan awoke to the sound of birds or something like birds, chirping from the treetops high above the cave entrance. At first he thought it had all been a dream. The crash, the forest, the giantess, but when he sat up and saw the enormous mossy cushion beneath him, the giant stone shelves towering like cliffs, and the strange scent of glowing fruit in the air, reality struck him. Again like a fist. He was still in the cave, still with her, the giantess. Evan rubbed his temples and winced. His wound had stopped bleeding, but a dull ache remained. Somehow, whatever blue liquid she had used on him had worked like a healing gel. Maybe even better. As he stood, he noticed something new. He was no longer on the cushion. He was inside a cage. It wasn't a metal cage, but a hollowed-out log with wooden bars across the open end, fastened with giant vines. It was easily big enough for him to stand in, move around, even lie down, but it was still a cage, and it confirmed his worst fears. He had been brought here like food, to be stored, to be eaten later. His throat tightened. All her kindness, her soft touch, her concern, it was a trick. Just like predators lured prey into false safety. She was a carnivore. She was just waiting for the right moment. He kicked the bars. Let me out. I'm not some animal. His voice echoed off the cave walls. There was no response. He looked around and spotted the giantess, a few yards away, sitting near a pool of water that ran through the cave floor. She was weaving vines between her long fingers, crafting something with delicate precision. She turned when she heard him shout. Her large, luminous eyes settled on him. She rose slowly and walked over to the cage. Evan backed away, pressing himself against the wall of the log. Don't come closer. I have a weapon. He patted his belt but found it empty. His sidearm was gone. She must have taken it while he was unconscious. She knelt beside the cage. Her expression wasn't angry. In fact, she looked almost sad. She placed something beside the bars, a piece of fruit, glowing faintly blue like the healing liquid. It looked like a hybrid between a mango and a pear, but much larger. Evan frowned. What is this? Is this supposed to be my last meal? The giantess said something in her language, a series of soft, melodic sounds that were completely unfamiliar. She pointed to the fruit, then to his stomach, then made a slow chewing motion with her mouth. Evan stared. She was feeding him, not fattening him up. She stayed there a while, watching him with curiosity. Then, slowly, she reached into a pouch tied to her waist and pulled out his sidearm. She examined it in her fingers like it was a strange toy, then placed it gently on the ground in front of the cage. Evan's eyes narrowed. Was this a trick? She pointed at the gun, then at him. Then she pointed to herself and made a crossing motion with her arms like a shield. Was she saying she meant no harm? He didn't move. Not yet. The giantess stood up and left him alone again, sitting back near the pool. She began humming softly, a low, soothing sound that echoed across the cavern like a lullaby. Evan sat in the cage, heart still pounding. He stared at the fruit. He was starving. He picked it up, sniffed it, then cautiously took a bite. It was sweet, almost like honey, but had a cooling effect on his tongue. Whatever it was, it didn't seem poisoned. After a few bites he felt stronger. He picked up his weapon and held it in his hands. He could shoot her, right now. Try to escape, but where would he go? The forest outside was wild and full of unknown threats. He had no idea where he was or how far from his crashed ship. His chums were still dead, and despite everything, she hadn't hurt him. Not even once. The cage wasn't even locked tightly. The vines were more like loose ties than real restraints. He could slip out if he really wanted to. That's when a thought hit him. What if the cage wasn't to keep him in, but to protect him? Outside the log, the world was giant-sized. If she had enemies or if dangerous creatures wandered in, maybe this small space was the only place where he could be safe. She came back an hour later, holding something new, a piece of bark, flattened and marked with symbols. She sat across from the cage and placed it down, then used a stick dipped in some kind of berry juice to draw on it. A picture appeared, a small figure, him, then a larger figure, her, next to each other, then a dark shadow above them. Something monstrous. She pointed to the drawing. Then to the entrance of the cave. Evan blinked. She was trying to tell him something, that there were others, and that those others were dangerous. Maybe she hadn't caged him to trap him. Maybe she was protecting him from something worse. Evan lowered his weapon and stepped closer to the bars. He looked at her carefully, really studying her expression. There was no hunger there. No madness. Only loneliness. And concern. He sat down, still inside the cage, and placed his weapon beside him. Okay, he whispered. I'll give you a chance. The giantess smiled, just slightly. Then she placed her hand near the cage. Evan hesitated, then stepped forward and touched one of her massive fingers. Her skin was warm, not threatening. And for the first time, Evan didn't feel like prey. He felt safe. The language of giants. The days passed, slowly but strangely, peacefully for Evan, inside the cave. He had stopped thinking of the hollow log as a cage. In truth, he could step out at any time now, but something inside him told him not to. Not because he was afraid of the giantess, but because he was afraid of what was beyond the cave walls. The forest out there breathed like a living creature. At night, strange howls echoed through the trees, and glowing eyes sometimes peeked from the shadows near the entrance. And every night the giantess sat quietly near the waterfall entrance, her back straight and still, as if standing guard. Evan had learned her name now, Kareel. She had drawn it in the dirt beside his own name. It wasn't letters like his, but symbols, beautiful curved lines and dots that pulsed with some kind of energy. She said it once while placing her hand on her chest. Kareel then pointed at him. He answered with Evan. She smiled and repeated it with a soft rhythm. It sounded musical in her voice. They began teaching each other, not with words at first, but with drawings and gestures. Evan used flat stones and sticks to carve symbols. He pointed to objects and mimed their use. Water, food, fire, weapon. Kareel was quick to understand. She responded in kind, drawing the same objects but with her own symbols and sounds. They began creating a shared language, one picture at a time. Evan was amazed by how intelligent she was. She wasn't just mimicking. She understood. She had a logic to her language, a structure. And she laughed too. A deep echoing laugh that bounced off the cave walls whenever Evan tried to mimic her sounds and completely butchered them. He laughed, too, not because it was funny, but because it felt good. He hadn't laughed since the crash. Sometimes they would sit for hours just watching each other work. Evan tinkered with the broken pieces of his comms, trying to repair a basic transmitter. Carol would sit beside him carving long wooden flutes that made hauntingly beautiful sounds. One night she played a melody that made the entire cave shimmer with energy. The crystals in the walls vibrated faintly in rhythm with the tune. Evan had never heard anything like it. It wasn't just music. It was emotion, made sound. He didn't understand the meaning, but he felt it. It was sadness and loneliness. That night, as the melody faded, he asked her with gestures about her people. She paused, then drew in the dirt. There were many like her once. Tall beings with glowing skin and long flowing hair. They lived in harmony with the land, tending to forests, rivers, and creatures. But then darkness came. She drew ships falling from the sky, figures with weapons, fire spreading. Her people fled. Some were hunted, some vanished. Now she was alone. Evan stared at the drawings, his heart heavy. She wasn't just a giant, she was a survivor, a relic of something ancient and forgotten. And now, he had come crashing into her world like the ones who destroyed it before. He began helping her with daily tasks, carrying water in small bowls, gathering strange fruit, organizing her collection of carved stones. He was small and slow compared to her, but she always thanked him with a soft hum or a tap on the ground that meant good or finished. Every small act became part of their shared rhythm. Then one morning, as he worked near the cave entrance, he noticed something odd. A claw mark on a tree outside, deep and fresh. Carol noticed too. She went completely still. Her eyes narrowed and she slowly stood up, scanning the tree line. Something was watching them. That night, she didn't play music. Instead, she placed more stones around the entrance. Not random, but arranged in a circle. A barrier. A warning. Then she drew a new symbol. In the dirt. Something large with many limbs. Not like her. Not like Evan. Something else. Dangerous. Evan checked his weapon. It still had limited charge. Maybe 1 or 2 shots. Not enough. He returned to his transmitter and began working faster. He needed to send a signal. Someone had to come. But he knew that if they did, they might not see Karel the way he did. They'd see a threat, a creature, not a friend. He looked over at her. She was sitting with her back to him, her long white hair flowing like a river across her shoulders. She looked tired, not from work but from waiting, from watching, from carrying the weight of a world lost. He walked over and placed a hand on her finger. She turned her head and looked down at him with a soft glow in her eyes. He pointed to himself, then to her, then to the cave home. He whispered she didn't understand the word, but she smiled and nodded. They didn't need the same language to understand that anymore. They were no longer strangers. The bond deepens. The days turned slower as the silence between Evan and Karen began to feel less like emptiness and more like comfort. The giantess would wake before the twin suns rose above the misty treetops and begin her day in a rhythm that had existed long before Evan had arrived. She would gather fruit from trees that bent only to her touch, draw water from the spring that cut through the cave like a river of light, and care for a nest of glowing birds that lived above the crystal ledge. Evan followed her silently, learning the way her world moved. He had stopped keeping track of time. The stars above the forest no longer matched Earth's skies, and the flow of day and night was strange but peaceful. His injury had healed now, and the bruises from the crash were almost gone. What had not healed yet was the weight in his chest, a growing feeling that this place was not just strange but special, and that he did not want to leave it. Or her Carol had changed. She no longer watched Evan from a distance. She sat close, now often letting him rest against her arm while they watched the crystal wall reflect the moving colors of the sky. She would hum to him, sometimes melodies that shifted from joy to sorrow to something deeper that had no name. He listened with closed eyes, trying to remember each note. One afternoon while foraging with her, Evan stumbled upon something strange beneath the roots of a massive purple tree. It was a broken panel of technology, scorched and half buried, not human design but familiar. He showed it to Kareel, and her face tightened. She led him back to the cave in silence, then drew new symbols in the dirt. A ship had come, not from Earth, not long ago. Evan worked late into the night on his transmitter, splicing wires with melted shards of his flight suit, threading power through the cracked motherboard. He couldn't wait any longer. If another ship was here, then someone else knew about this place. And if they weren't like him, if they saw Kareel as a threat, he had to warn her. Or stop them. She watched him from the corner, her glowing eyes filled with something more than curiosity. She seemed to understand the urgency that something was coming, that the world they had built between them was beginning to tremble. That night the stars flickered with unnatural rhythm. Evan noticed the pattern blinking in sequence too regular to be natural. A signal. Someone was nearby. A ship, maybe a scout, and it wasn't human, he told Kareel, through gestures, through symbols and drawings. Danger. Outsiders. Weapons. Her face darkened. She stood and walked to the cave entrance, peering into the forest, where the trees swayed too hard in the windless air. Then they came. The first scream was not a voice, but a sound that cracked the silence. A shriek, like metal being torn apart, echoed through the trees. Kareel reacted instantly, pulling Evan behind a wall of stone as figures emerged from the darkness. They were tall, not like her, but taller than humans, armored in black and gray, their faces hidden behind masks that glowed with red eyes. There were 3 of them. Each carried weapons that pulsed with dark energy. Kareel stepped forward, her body blocking the entrance. She made a sound, deep and sharp, not a threat but a warning. The lead hunter raised his weapon without hesitation. Evan shouted and ran to the side of the cave, pulling out his small weapon. It was nothing compared to theirs, but he fired once, the bolt striking a rock and drawing their attention. The second hunter turned and fired back, the blast narrowly missing Evan and blasting a chunk of crystal into the air. Carol moved like a storm. Her hand swept forward, knocking one of the hunters into a tree with a crash that shook the cave. The third fired at her, but she shielded her face with a thick slab of stone and charged. Her strength was terrifying but controlled. She didn't kill. She fought to defend. Evan used the chaos to set off a trap he had built from broken tech and vine snares. One of the hunters was caught in the blast of a discharged energy cell, flung backward into the underbrush. The last turned and fled, vanishing into the forest. The cave fell silent again. Only the wind, whispering through the broken trees, staggered back, her arm bleeding from a deep gash. Evan ran to her, pulling pieces of his torn shirt to press against the wound. She sat heavily, her breathing slow but steady. She placed one hand on his chest and gave a small nod. Gratitude. He stayed by her side all night, tending the wound, watching for any sign of return. He couldn't sleep. Not because of fear, but because now he knew they had found her. They would come again, and this time they wouldn't send just 3. He looked at the broken transmitter, then at her, then at the stars. He had to make a choice. Soon the attack morning did not come gently to the forest. The sky above the canopy glowed with an uneasy orange, as if the sun itself was unsure whether to rise. The birds that usually filled the air with strange melodies had gone silent. The wind had stopped. The trees stood still. Evan felt at first in his chest a tightness, like the calm before a storm. Carol had not moved much since the fight. Her wound was still raw, but she hid the pain behind silence. Her eyes flicked to the tree line every few minutes, watching, listening. Evan had been working non-stop. His transmitter had sparked to life in the middle of the night for just a moment, a flicker of green on the broken screen. He had sent out a brief burst, a coded signal. One chance. If any human ship was passing nearby, they might pick it up. He knew the risk. Bringing more people here could mean Carol would be seen as a threat, but after what had happened, he knew it was only a matter of time before the enemy came back. And next time they would bring more than three. Carol stood at the entrance again, her frame outlined by the glow of the crystal walls. She had sharpened a massive wooden spear with the tip burned black for strength. It looked primitive, but in her hands it was like a tower of power. She had drawn a ring of symbols around the cave in the dirt, glowing softly like energy traps or wards. Evan could not read them, but he felt their purpose. Defense, warning, maybe something deeper, a kind of magic or science he didn't understand. Then it happened. The sky changed. A deep hum rolled across the forest like a wave of pressure shaking the leaves. Birds erupted from the treetops in a chaotic swarm. Carol turned to Evan, her eyes wide. He already had his weapon in hand. A small, blinking red light on his wrist device told him something had entered the atmosphere. Not human, not friendly. The forest exploded with noise. Figures moved through the trees, not 3, not 5, but at least a dozen. Armored hunters like before, but with heavier gear. One carried a cannon-like weapon across his back. Another had a drone flying above his shoulder, scanning the terrain with a red beam. They moved fast, coordinated. Carol stepped forward and roared a deep sound that shook the cave walls. It was not fear. It was fury. She had been hunted enough. She would not run again. Evan ducked behind a rock and pulled the trigger on his weapon. The first bolt hit a hunter square in the chest, knocking him back but not down. Their armor was stronger now. Another turned and fired toward him, missing by inches. Carol charged. She moved like thunder, every step cracking stone. Her spear swung wide, slamming into 2 hunters and sending them flying through the air. One crashed into a tree with a sickening crunch. Another tried to fire, but she caught him with her hand and hurled him into the waterfall. Levin used every trick he knew. He triggered his last energy trap, a shock burst that sent 3 hunters to the ground, twitching. He grabbed the flare from his belt and ignited it, tossing it into the dense brush as a distraction. Red light burst outward, and for a moment the enemy scattered, but they regrouped quickly. The hunter with the cannon stepped forward and aimed straight at Carol. She turned too late. The blast struck her shoulder, sending her crashing into the side of the cave. Evan screamed her name and fired wildly to cover her. She didn't move. He ran to her side, diving under falling dust and stone. Her body was too big to move, but he saw her eyes open faintly. She was still breathing. The cannon hunter stepped forward, charging another shot. Evan stood in front of her, his small frame shaking but steady. He raised his weapon, but he knew it would do nothing. Then a sound cracked through the sky. Second ship broke through the clouds above. Sleek silver marked with the symbol of the United Terran Alliance. His signal had worked. The enemy hunters turned their heads just as the dropship opened fire. Precision blasts struck the ground near them, forcing them to scatter. Human soldiers dropped down on jetpacks, weapons drawn, scanning the field. Avon raised both hands and shouted over the chaos. Down. She's not the enemy. The Terran commander landed near him, scanning Caril with the visor. What is that? He asked coldly. She's not a what, Evan said, stepping between them. She's Cartel. She saved my life. She saved this whole planet from them. The commander frowned. She's a Class 5 non-human entity. We'll need to detain her for study. No, Evan said firmly. If you take her, she'll die in a lab. You can't understand her by locking her up. She's not dangerous unless she's hunted. The commander hesitated, then tapped his kumedics forward. Secure the wounded. Giant Van turned to Caril and touched her hand. They're here. Caril, he whispered, but they don't understand yet. Give me time. She looked at him with tired eyes and nodded once. The medics arrived with cranes and harnesses, carefully lifting her into the cargo bay. Evan followed, watching the forest fade behind him as the ship rose. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew one thing: he would not let her become a specimen. He would make them see what he saw: a protector, a friend, a giant, a choice of worlds. The ship's hum was steady, but Evan's heartbeat was not. He sat beside the massive containment field where Carl lay still. She had been sedated, not violently but carefully, her breath slow, her eyes half open. She did not struggle. She had seen enough to know what came next. She was surrounded by machines larger than tanks, mechanical arms scanning her every inch. Scientists moved like shadows, taking notes, pressing buttons, whispering to each other as if she were just an object of and had argued all the way up into orbit. He told them everything he had seen, the truth about the hunters, the evidence on the ground, the ship remains in the forest, and the injuries Carol had suffered to protect him. The commander had nodded politely and had filed his report and had smiled without warmth. "We'll take it from here, Mr. Miles." It not heard. That one word made Evan feel colder than the stars outside the window. He stood outside the viewing platform, watching Earth grow larger through the glass as the ship neared the Terran orbital station. Earth looked peaceful from up here, silent, blue, and beautiful, but down there waited the ones who would never understand what Carell really was. A council hearing had been scheduled within hours. Evan was summoned not as a witness, but as a formality, a pilot with a lucky survival story. The real decisions would be made by men and women who had never touched the moss of that forest or heard Cartel's voice humming beneath a crystal sky. He walked into the hearing chamber, his boots clicking against the polished floor. Screens surrounded the room showing images of Karina inside her containment bay, her vitals pulsing in the corner. Council members watched him with clinical interest. They asked questions about her biology, her strength, her size, her possible threat. Lee answered calmly, until they asked the final question: "Do you believe this entity is intelligent and capable of emotional reasoning?" He looked at the screen where she lay, and then back at them. "She's more than that. She's kind. She healed me. She protected me. She sang songs about her people. She risked her life for a stranger. She's not just intelligent. She's better than most of us." A few council members exchanged looks. One of them, an older woman, leaned forward and, "Do you believe she poses a threat to humanity only if we make her our enemy?" The chamber fell silent that night. Evan visited the containment bay again. They had moved her into a facility deeper in the station. She was now surrounded by reinforced barriers, energy fields, and robotic guards. She looked smaller, somehow, inside all the steel. He approached the glass and placed his hand against it. Carell stirred. Her eyes opened slowly. When she saw him, she moved her hand weakly toward the same spot. Their palms met through the barrier. "Sorry," he whispered. She blinked slowly, then tilted her head. She didn't speak his words, but her look said more than any language could. She forgave him. He knew then he couldn't let it end this way. He left the bay and walked straight to the engineering deck. There he found an old friend, Captain Myra Tolan, a smuggler turned transport pilot who owed him more than a few favors. She listened to his story without blinking. "You're crazy," she said after he finished. "You want me to break a classified alien out of a Terran facility inside a military station? Do you have any idea what they'll do to you?" He nodded. "Then why?" "Because she's not a thing. She's not a weapon. She's the last of her kind. And because she didn't let me die alone in that forest, I won't let her die here either." Mira stared at him for a long time, then sighed. "You always pick the impossible ones." They made the plan in silence. Timing would be everything. Mira had access codes from her old transport days. Evan still had clearance as a surviving pilot. They would disable the energy field for 30 seconds, reroute the internal drones, and use an emergency cargo pod to slip through the station's lower dock. At the appointed hour, the alarms began to blare. "Containment breach reported in Sector 12." Evan ran as fast as he could down the sterile halls, punching in override codes, opening sealed doors, dodging startled technicians. He reached Carell's chamber just as Mira cracked the final lock. The field dropped. Carell looked at him confused, dazed from the sedatives. He climbed up the platform, grabbed her hand, and whispered, "Come on, we're going home." She moved slowly, her strength returning in bursts. Together they climbed into the cargo pod, barely fitting inside. Mira's voice came through the comms. "You've got 2 minutes before they scramble interceptors. Do it." The pod launched with a violent shudder and plunged toward open space. The stars spun as the ship fired up its cloaking field and vanished into the black. Inside the pod, Carell rested her head against the wall. Evan sat beside her, breathing hard, heart still racing. She looked at him and smiled faintly. He smiled back. They had escaped, but more than that, they had chosen each other, not out of survival, but out of something deeper, something that neither species had. words for yet, but they would find them together not. Like that, the stars outside the small vessel blinked like ancient eyes watching, as the pod drifted through the quiet of deep space. For Evan and Cariel, silence was no longer threatening. It was peace. For the first time since the crash, there were no alarms, no hostile stares, no cages, no questions, only the steady rhythm of their breathing, and the sound of the ship's hum guiding them far from Earth, far from those who had failed to understand. Riel slept most of the journey, her body still recovering from the drugs used by the Terran scientists, her massive frame curled awkwardly inside the cargo vessel, barely fitting, but Evan had lined the walls with salvaged cushioning and hung strips of soft cloth to block the harsh lights. He had turned the space into a kind of home, not much, but it was better than the cold lab cell they had left behind. Evan spent his time checking star charts, adjusting flight paths, and rerouting through hidden ports and asteroid fields. Mira had given them a contact on a neutral world far from Terran space, a world where strange species mingled, and where no one asked questions if you paid enough to keep their curiosity quiet. Evan knew it was temporary, but it was enough. Just long enough to find something better. When Cariel finally woke, she did not speak. She placed her hand on Evan's chest and listened to his heartbeat. That was their language now. Silence, gestures, eye contact, and a kind of understanding deeper than words. Evan had come to believe that the need to speak had always been more about filling space than about connection. With Cariel, everything was already understood weeks past. The ship landed on a moonlit world called Idris, a place hidden behind gas giants and ancient trade routes. It was a sanctuary built by exiles, smugglers, ex-scientists, and those who had seen too much. No governments ruled there, no flags flew. Evan rented a small shelter outside the main outpost where the air was clean and the nights were quiet. Cariel could walk freely without fear of guns, or scanners, or orders shouted over ComSunday as they sat beside a blue glowing lake. Evan opened a box of old items he had managed to salvage before their escape. Among them was a small recording device, one he had used to document flight logs during missions. He played it, and a distorted version of his own voice echoed into the air pilot. Miles mission log day 5. Cariel tilted her head, curious. Evan smiled and began to scroll through the recordings. Most were damaged, but a few survived. One in particular caught his attention. Pilot Miles mission log day 9. Saw something out there today, something bigger than anything I've known. She looked at me like I was a bird lost in a storm. I think I'm scared not of her but of what she sees in me. He paused the recording. That was before I knew you. Riel looked at him for a long moment, then reached into the dirt with her fingers and began to draw. It was a simple symbol, a circle inside another, then a mark through the center. Evan recognized it from their earliest days in the cavit, meant Bonhi. Added his own mark beside hers, the symbol for choice. The next morning, Evan entered the Idris archives, a long underground chamber filled with dusty records, alien tech, and worn data pads. At the desk sat a being with translucent skin and dozens of blinking eyes. Want to register a new species, Evan said. The being raised what might have been its eyebrows and nodded slowly. Name the Suralai, he said, remembering the song Cariel had once hummed, the melody that meant people of the Tricerogen world, uncharted sector Gamma, for unclaimed by any government's sentient fully evidence. Give you more than evidence, I'll give you the truth. He left that day with a packet of forms, codes, and the promise of a hearing before the Interplanetary Alliance. It was not much, but it was the first step. If Cariel was to have a future, it had to begin with recognition. Back at the lake, Evan told her everything. She listened silently, then picked up a handful of water, letting it fall through her fingers like a slow rainfall. When she turned to him, her eyes were no longer just soft or curious. They were proudly through that evening as they walked through the forest. Evan turned and asked the question that had lingered in the back of his mind since the day they met. Back when I first saw you, I thought you were going to eat me. Cariel made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sigh. She knelt and looked him straight in the eyes, her face inches from his. Then she placed a hand on her chest and drew a symbol into the dirt beside them. It was the same circle again, but this time with two small lines beside it. Then she touched his chest and drew the same symbol again. Not food, not prequel. He sat down beside her and stared at the sky. You didn't want to eat mesh. Tilted her head slightly, then placed her forehead gently against his neck. Like that, Evan smiled, the kind of smile that comes not from amusement but from understanding. In the silence that followed, two different worlds finally became one. Not through conquest, but through a single choice to see each other completely.